It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Stickgold, who's going to be sharing with you his enormous body of work about sleep and memory. So thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to the program for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be talking about sleep. Yep, get it or forget it. I'm going to be talking about why we have to sleep and what we get from it. Now, I saw the hands go up with how many of you aren't getting enough sleep. So I think I'll repeat some of the things that Chuck said because you know how that helps, right? So do we have to sleep? Well, here's what we know. We know that rats die without sleep. If you sleep deprive a rat for 2 weeks, it will invariably die. So rats need it. The same is true for humans. Now, Harvard Medical won't let us do that particular experiment. But there's a genetic condition known as fatal familial insomnia, which says it all. It's a prion disease. Harvard's gotten in my way here, so I can't. Can you people see the bottom of the? Some can and some can't. So there's one amino acid here. Oop, that's the wrong button. Back. There's one amino acid that's mutated in this protein. It's a prion disease, sort of like mad cow disease, except what it does is it causes people in midlife, in their 40s and 50s, to slowly lose the ability to sleep at all. And within 1 to 4 months after they stop sleeping, they all die. So humans need to sleep too. And maybe the most impressive data comes from studies of sea mammals, cetaceans, who can't afford to sleep because if they fell asleep, they would sink and drown. And so evolution, rather than simply eliminating sleep, which would have been relatively easy as a genetic fix, instead taught these animals to sleep on 1/2 of their brain at a time. So they'll be sleeping with just their right brain, and then they'll sleep with just their left brain. And in that way manage to keep swimming even if it's just around in circles, and keep themselves alive. So they need to sleep, and you do too. Now, I'm going to talk today about several reasons that you need to sleep. Main one will be around memory and learning, but I'm also going to review some of the things Chuck said in terms of immune function, in terms of hormone regulation, and that clearing of toxins from the brain. Mood regulation, Chuck mentioned also, and learning and memory. So let's go through them one at a time, and let's see if I can convince you. If you take a bunch of individuals and give them a vaccination for hepatitis, and then look at the production of antibodies over time, it turns out that the body doesn't really start manufacturing the antibodies until after a couple of weeks. And for that time, those subjects who were slept normally and those who were sleep deprived for 1 night after receiving their immunization shot look pretty similar. But over the next 2 weeks, you see this effect. So that by 28 days, people who were sleep deprived for 1 night after receiving an immunization will have only half as much of an antibody production against the hepatitis, making you much, much more likely to not have sufficient immunization to protect you. Chuck mentioned the effects on insulin regulation. This is a study with subjects, college students, being restricted to 4 hours of sleep a night, not total deprivation, but 4 hours of sleep a night for 5 days. And after that, the rate at which their bodies could clear glucose out of their blood was reduced by 40%. The acute response to insulin was down by 30%, and they looked pre-diabetic. So just 5 days of half the normal amount of sleep is enough to make you look like you're getting type 2 diabetes. And Chuck talked about that clearance of metabolites from the brain. Beta amyloid is one of the 2 proteins that accumulates outside of the cells in your brain that is tightly linked to the development of Alzheimer's disease And when you are asleep, you're clearing it out of your brain twice as fast as when you're awake. And even a single night of sleep deprivation leads to a measurable increase in the burden of beta amyloid in the brain. So I want to talk mostly about sleep-dependent memory evolution. I call it memory evolution because we used to talk about memory consolidation, this idea that you form a memory and a few hours later it's sort of cemented into your brain and then it's there forever. But if you have a spouse of any gender, you're aware of this phenomenon that as time goes on, your memories of events separate. Usually it's your spouse's memory who gets worse, right? But that sort of constant changing of our memories over years and years is what I refer to as memory evolution. And it's not just whether you remember it or not, but the details of how you remember it. So here's an example. Actually, this is something that Chuck referred to also, about the impact of sleep on just your ability to remember, in this case, just words. Here's the protocol. Subjects either are sleep deprived for a night. Too many buttons, not enough time. Are either sleep deprived for a night or get a normal night of sleep before coming into the lab to be exposed to a couple of hundred words on the screen. They're neutral, negative, and positive words. They're just asked to indicate, is this a positive word or a negative or neutral word? And then unbeknownst to them, when they come back a couple of days later, they receive a surprise test. It was not unbeknownst to them. Here, it was only unbeknownst to them. There. So they give them the test, and it's a simple recognition test. They show them all 200 words that they had seen before, plus another 200, and ask them, which have you seen before and which haven't you? And here's what we see. In the group that slept well the night before they encoded it, memory recognition is quite high, both for the positive words and the negative words. It's reduced substantially for neutral words, but that's something we know a lot about our lives, that we remember the emotional parts. But when we test them 2 days later, when we test the ones who were sleep deprived, and again, they're being tested after 2 full nights of recovery sleep, so they're not tired anymore. When we test them for their memory for the positive words is reduced about in half. Their memory for the negative words is reduced about in half. But their memory for the negative words is mostly maintained. Meaning that if you were sleep deprived when you saw these words, you are twice as likely to remember the negative words as the positive or neutral ones. So when if I'm in the psychiatry department, if someone comes into the psychiatrist and says, my wife says I have to come and see a psychiatrist, she says I'm depressed because I only remember the bad things that happen. Truly, he may be depressed, but he might also just be sleep deprived. That's enough to give you this sense that only the negative things are remembered. That's bad on the individual level. It can be catastrophic on the national level. I have this suspicion that the entire cause of the first Gulf War, seriously now, was this effect. Because you had decision makers who were highly sleep deprived trying to decide whether we should attack or not. And they're remembering, we've got these satellite photographs of these trucks that might be biological warfare, weapon development trucks. We've got to do something about it. And they forget, they were also told that they looked like falafel trucks too. And that's kind of funny, but that's where our mind goes when we're sleep restricted, when we're sleep deprived. And the decisions could be made on that basis of an over remembering, and over dependence on negative memories. Now that's what happens when you're sleep restricted or sleep deprived before you learn something. What my work is really focused on, and what's really quite surprising to me when I found it, and to most other people, is that the sleep you get after you learn something is probably more important than the sleep you get before. I am the only lecturer whose lecture you will ever attend who will take it as a compliment if you fall asleep while I'm talking. Because I know you're just trying to enhance your memory of that event. Now, how big of an effect does that have? Here's one example. I'm going to take you through 3 examples altogether. But this is just a very simple test. What you're doing here is you're trying to learn to spot these diagonal bars in the lower left quadrant of your visual field when we flash pictures like this on the screen very quickly. And what we do when we train you on it is we see how fast we can flash that up there, and you still have 80% accuracy in detecting whether those bars are above each other like they are there or next to each other. And then we bring you back 12 hours later and give you the exact same test, and again, see how fast we can go before you can't do it. What do we find? Well, I'm saying we bring you back. I'm assuming you're all undergraduates, yes, because that's who we did the study with. What we find is that if we retest these subjects after 3, 6, or 9, or 12 hours, there's no improvement in how fast they can do the task if they're awake during this time. But if we let them sleep between training and testing, they're about 15 to 20% faster. Doesn't matter how long the time interval is, it only matters whether they slept or not. And in fact, we can wait even longer to test them. These are groups of subjects who were tested. I showed you the 0 and 1 day data, but these are other groups tested after 2, 3, 4, or 7 days, and they continue to get better without any practice. So it's not practice that makes perfect. It's practice plus sleep that makes perfect. And the terrifying finding is that if you sleep-deprived subjects for the first night after you train them, subsequent sleep is of no value whatsoever. So that after 2 full nights of recovery sleep, their performance here is not significantly different from baseline. So you have to get sleep, and you have to get it tonight. There's this concept of sleep bulimia, which is a binge purge concept. College students love it. They binge sleep on the weekends, and then they purge, getting 4 or 5 hours a night during the week. And they tell us that they're fine. They make it up on the weekend. Well, they might make it up in terms of getting back to full alertness, but it's really too late to remember what they didn't remember because they didn't sleep that first night. Now, sleep does much more complicated things than simply make us faster or stronger in our memories. It can do things like enhance verbal memory in some unexpected ways. So we did a study, and Jessica Payne was the lead on this. I'm sorry, a lot of my slides will have my coworkers and students listed. I should be clear that whenever I say we did something, I mean they did something, right? So with that admission, let me go forward. What the subjects in this study did is they heard on a tape 8 lists of words, and we're told, try to remember the words. We're going to test you on them later. And then either 20 minutes later or 12 hours later, we would test them. I'm going to give you a sense of what that's like. I'm going to show you one list. Now, they heard it on an audio tape. I'm going to show you the list. And I'm going to give you the same instructions as I gave them. Try to remember these words. You're going to be tested on it. Okay, so in the actual study, there were 8 lists, not 1. It was auditory, not visual. And we actually just gave them a blank sheet of paper retest and had them write down what they remembered. That would be cumbersome here. So I'm going to show you words and ask you to raise your hands if you remember seeing them. Okay? Now, for those of you who aren't MDs, you might not know that there are extensor muscles in this part of the arm. This is not raising your hand. This is not raising your hand. I want everybody around you to see how smart you are, okay? So, for each of these words, if you remember seeing it, raise your hand. Oh, good. It's always embarrassing when we get hit. Okay. Good. Excellent. Good. What can I say? Well, if you looked around, you know you weren't alone. In fact, all 8 lists were generated the same way. We gave words like sleep to a couple of hundred psych students in introductory psych in college and said, write down the first 10 words that come to your mind when you think of sleep. And then we took the 10 or 12 that they wrote down most commonly, and for each of the lists, we would show the subjects in our study those words, but not the word that it was based on. And what we see is that classically 60 to 80, it looked like more like 90% of the subjects here, will mistakenly respond that they remember seeing the word. And that's because our brain is always extracting gist. It's when you go home and tell your family and you call your friends to talk about my great talk, you'll say, he showed us all the words related to sleep. And it doesn't matter what the words were, right? It's just the gist that's important. And our brain is very good at identifying those gists and holding on to them. So the question that Jess Payne asked was the following. What happens to that memory over time? So we had 4 groups of subjects. Some were trained in the morning, 2 groups in the morning, and 2 trained in the evening. In each condition, 1 group was tested after just 20 minutes to give us a sense of how well they formed these memories. And the other group was tested after 12 hours. And we can look at the difference to see how much are they forgetting across 12 hours, okay? Now, the ones who were trained in the morning and tested that evening were awake for the 12 hours. We told them no naps. Whereas those trained in the evening, tested the next morning, got a full night of sleep in between. And what do we see? Well, first of all, for those in the wake group, across the day, they forget about 40 to 45% of the words that the 20-minute group could remember. And even after sleep, they're forgetting about 25% of those words. That's of the words that they actually saw. But when you look at the words that weren't shown, those gist words that the brain came up with, they're still forgetting about 20% of them across a day awake. But across the night, the brain holds on to them tenaciously. It's holding on to the memory of what it thinks is most important. So that when you wake up in the morning, you have a memory that might be less accurate, but more useful in understanding what had happened. Now, you could imagine this happening for evolutionary reasons. In the previous, nope, wrong talk, sorry. So there are even, yeah, I need more sleep, it's true. There are even more sophisticated and impressive things that the brain does with our memories while we're asleep. And here's an example. In this study, subjects were shown 1, 2, or 3 of these cards on each of 200 trials and asked to predict whether it was going to be sunny or rainy in this simulated world, which might not seem obvious to you, but fortunately on these 200 trials we gave them feedback. So for example, on the first trial they might see this card and it turns out to be sunny, and if they're undergraduates they say, whatever. And then in the second trial they might see these 2 cards together and it turns out to be rainy. And one of the fun things about the human brain is that it's always making models. and coming up with hypotheses and trying to understand. So most of you at this point have probably sort of said to yourself, okay, that one means sunny and these two mean rainy, and I don't remember what the fourth one was, but that one probably means sunny too. So we build these models, and then across 200 trials we test them. And so indeed, along comes the third trial, and they say, okay, I've got this one, and it turns out to be rainy. And now they're totally confused, right? In fact, they think, I must not have remembered correctly what happened here. But the gimmick in this study is that each of the cards has a certain probability of being associated with sun or rain. So 80% of the times you see the triangles, it's going to turn out to be rainy, but only 20% of the time you see the squares will be rainy. And although no one can quite grasp this all, they get a good model of it. It's a kind of learning that we call probabilistic learning, and humans are horrible at it. But they get the gist, okay? So that after these 200 trials, always with the feedback of the correct answer, we give them 100 trials with no feedback and ask whether they're guessing the optimal choice. And they get 70, 80 of them out of 100 correct. They're doing really well. Nobody's getting 100. Nobody really understands the rules fully, but they're pretty good at it. Then we send them away for 12 hours and do the exact same test. Same 100 same 100 stimuli. And in the subjects who were trained in the morning and tested that evening without sleep, they get a couple of extra cards correct, but not significantly more than they were at baseline. It's impressive that they remember what they learned, but they certainly aren't getting better. After a night of sleep, they're 10% better. They're doing better on this task after a night of sleep than they were right after they learned it. In a very real sense, these subjects, when they wake up in the morning, have a better understanding of how the world works than they had when they went to bed the night before. And that's what sleep is giving them. So you do need to sleep, or rather, you need to sleep. You need to sleep to maintain alertness and optimal cognitive functioning, to optimize your immune defenses, to maintain hormonal regulation and weight, to prevent beta amyloid buildup and Alzheimer's, to permit sleep-dependent learning and memory consolidation, and as Chuck pointed out, just to be happy. Or, to put it another way, if you don't get enough sleep, you'll end up stupid, fat, sick, and unhappy. The choice is yours. Thank you. I'll introduce you.